Okay, now can you all see me? All right, we're good. Everybody can see me now, it sounds like. Okay. This is my first time ever doing this, so honestly, and I actually just realized I don't need those headphones. Everybody hear me fine as well? We have one person saying nope while everybody else says yes. I'm sorry to whoever is saying nope. My apologies to whoever you are. All right, well, I'm gonna mostly ignore the chat now, just because there's a million things going on there right now. So we're just gonna start into the presentation, but I'm gonna have a question and answer thing going on at the end, and we'll talk about some of this stuff that we've talked about at that point, and take some questions. All right, just making sure that everybody's getting the sound. Okay, everybody's getting the sound. All right. So we're going to talk about applying character design principles to anything. And this is kind of a weird subject to pick, but obviously you are all interested in it. But I wanted to talk about why and what we're doing. But before we get too much into the presentation, I just wanted to bring up a assignment for everybody to work on. So while I'm talking and kind of working through this presentation here, you can all be sketching and trying to work out ideas. So this is a design brief for all of you. So this is the witch's hideout. I'm imagining a story that's witches that are essentially using nanobots as their magic. And so you can see the characters that this is kind of based on down below, and we're designing their hideout. And I want you to try and find as much as possible kind of the character design principles that I'm going to be talking about, and infuse the designs with this idea. So this place, it's supposed to be a rough wood shack that's high in the trees of the haunted wood, which the witches are going to retreat to after attacking the Duke's caravans as they pass over the ancient forest. So I'm imagining this is kind of a mixture of ancient and modern. There should be this mixture of wildness to the forest and to the shack, but we'll have these kind of high-tech solutions kind of jury-rigged over the top. So anyway, we are going to be having you hopefully sketching and working out that idea. If you decide not to, that's totally fine also, but I hope that some of you will have fun at least trying to figure out this idea, and then at the end I'm going to work a little bit with this idea. So we all love character design, and I even put character design in the title because I know that everybody's really drawn to the idea of learning about character design. But the reality is that even the best character designers working on a project are going to, they're going to be at various times of the year having to design other things, just because there's not always character designs to do. And so you're going to be designing stuff like lab equipment and how it kind of fits into the lab. You'll be designing stuff like a forest floor and all the types of things that are going to be happening there. You may be designing vehicles, and you may be designing rocks. There's every single case, you need to be finding a way to make this thing fun, and the way to make it have fun, or to make it so that people have fun as they look at it, and of course the team that's coming after you that'll be creating this stuff, that they'll also have fun, is to infuse it with character design. Specifically, the more that you can get kind of a character feeling to a rock or a tree or to a vehicle, the more and more people will find that thing kind of resonating with them, and it'll be much more interesting to them. So first we're going to start with the low-hanging fruit. This is the stuff that's super easy to find, and so we'll talk about those. First of all, you're going to get things that feel like they are almost a character already, right? Vertical elements. Maybe they've got like something that could look like a hat with eyes hooded underneath. Maybe they've got an element that looks a little bit like an arm or legs. So these sort of upright or more face-oriented types of things. You can bring character design elements into them much more easily and treat them as you would a character. You can even pose and give them a gesture just like you would. And you can see these quick sketches that I did of a watchtower. Each one has a very different personality and has a lot of character because it's really working to every element, every proportional change, every gestural kind of shift is giving you the feeling of a person that's doing that thing. So that's one of the low-hanging fruit. The other thing that's kind of low-hanging fruit is finding a style overall for the property. And this type of thing, when you're looking at how the rules of the style apply across all of the stuff in the world, it may give you some ideas as to what type of story this is, what you should be expected to feel with the type of action that's going to happen in this world, all that sort of thing. And so this tends to be a little bit harder just because each individual piece of furniture may not have that much character to it, but when you look at them all together, when they're all kind of working off of the same rule set, you definitely start to get this feeling of character with it. Then the other low-hanging fruit is when you actually have some characters that you're associating the design with. So in this case, we have the characters that we're designing this stuff for, and you will have an easier time designing the witch's cottage because you know what characters are going to be living there and acting there. So when you're designing either prop clusters or items that those characters are going to be using, then you end up getting something that feels, it's definitely a lot easier anyway to get something that feels like it belongs to that character. You can kind of see based on the ones that I just showed you which one of these characters is going to go with each population cluster. You can imagine what type of things that person is going to be doing. You can figure out what type of items to include in there, what kind of architectural elements kind of fit what that person's personality is like. And so those are kind of the low-hanging fruit. Now I'm going to give you something that tends to be a little bit more difficult. So I'm going to teach you about a principle that probably a lot of you are familiar with. This is the concept of self-similarity. Some of you may be familiar with the idea of a fractal and how a fractal is kind of the same at the large level as it is at the smaller level, which is the same as at a smaller level. And so as you're thinking about self-similarity, that's kind of the idea. It's this kind of scalar reproduction of the same idea. And this is something that is built into the fabric of the universe. And the fact that this is built into the fabric of the universe, the fact that you see it everywhere in nature, the fact that we find it kind of this thing that we like, whether it's in ancient design, you see this a lot in cathedrals and other sorts of buildings. You see it in animals, you see it in well-designed cars. They're going to take the same element and kind of scale it and move it around and use it in different parts. So anyway, this idea of self-similarity, we just tend to resonate with it. In fact, if you're lucky enough to find truth anywhere that exists in the universe, you'll find that truth also has this fractal quality to it. And that's kind of a long discussion in and of itself, but there's this really cool quality to this self-similarity, and it's the reason why we find fractals interesting and all the stuff that has this sort of fractal quality to it as well. So the simplest way to think about this is this sort of phrase that I've got up top, which is the lesser is to the greater as the greater is to the whole. And that just means that as you're designing, you're going to be thinking about how they relate to one another. Now, self-similarity is not just a symmetry that happens on the scalar axis. Self-similarity, there's two kinds of it. One is actually where it's literally symmetrical and you're using the same element over and over again. But there's another type of self-similarity, which we're going to be talking about today, which is stochastic self-similarity. Stochastic self-similarity is when you have the same forces that formed the thing at the smaller, layer or level, affecting things at the upper levels, affecting things at the upper levels. And that's how we're going to be using it today, because sometimes you'll get to certain levels of the design where the exact rules you were applying earlier don't fit anymore. But if you can apply the same sort of forces, the same kind of design ideas to the new level, then you may be using different shapes. You might be adding in details that are not necessarily following those same rules, but it'll actually carry across the same idea. Now, this is really an abstract idea. So let's show you an example of it. So in this case, I have this idea in this, and this idea that I wrote here, poisoned by power, you can think of this as being essentially the forces that apply to this idea of self-similarity. And so, just checking really quickly to make sure that we're still getting through to everybody. So this idea of poisoned by power being the driving force behind our design is something that we can now translate into visual language. So for example, if you take the concept of poison and you think about design elements that would bring about this idea, for example, you might have stuff that feels like it's melting or dripping, like almost like an acid sort of feeling that suggests the idea of poison. You might have something that's leached or eaten away, something that feels like it's kind of grown pustules or is swollen in some way. You might think of pale colors, greens, and sickly sorts of things. These are all these kind of poison or poisonous ideas. Then you've got on the other side the concept of power, which you have this really, really regal sort of crown-like elements, very vertical things, strong things like hammers and thrones and things that have that kind of bold and regal sort of quality. You have Baroque scroll work, and then of course all the royal colors based on what context you're using them in. You might pick different things. So if we take these ideas and we plug them together and we think about how the power is actually the thing causing the poisoning, and we apply these ideas together, you can see that we can actually come up with motifs or variations on these motifs that will make them kind of communicate both ideas at once. Then when you have that idea, this sort of element or these design motifs that communicate the idea of poisoned by power, and we understand kind of what the forces are that are causing this to happen, then you can actually start applying these now at the large level. So if you're designing a castle that's supposed to say poisoned by power, you can bring these motifs and forces in at that level. When you get down to the prop level and you're looking at the candelabras or the sconces on the sides of the walls, they can also have some of those same elements, the sort of twisted melting and the pustules kind of growing, and also bringing in the crown-like elements and the strong elements, the Baroque scrollwork. They fuse together even at that level. Then even when you get all the way into the texture, you look up close against the door, we can bring those same motifs in once again. So this is what it means to apply self-similarity in something. And while this is kind of an abstract concept, when you do this at every level of a design, what happens is the story of that design and the ideas you're trying to communicate about that story, they come across at every level of the design in such a way that people feel a sense of character. So I'll show you an example of this, and I have the dreaded crate here because anybody here who has worked in games, you know what I'm talking about. The worst assignment you can possibly get to either model, design, whatever is, can you please design me some crates? And you're thinking, a wooden box, why do we even need a designer to do this? Can't we just get some generic thing? So this idea of the dreaded crate, I think if you can apply some of these principles that we've been talked about to a crate, then you know that you can control personality in just about anything. So if we take a wooden crate and we're just keeping it as wooden, first thing I would do is look at the reference that we would want to pull from. And so if we're going to be trying to bring out different personality elements, I want to have a bunch of different tools to pull from. So your reference searches should really be focused on what brings in an element. Sorry, dropped my phone there. What brings in an element of personality in each of these references? Each one has a different feeling to it. Each one brings a different story component to it. And so I'm going to be using that as I design. And you can see each of these crates here are bringing in those different elements, and you'll see that each one kind of reflects this different personality attribute. But you'll also notice that a lot of these, they don't actually feel like characters themselves, and yet they're using these character design principles, and it makes what might be a super generic sort of design task become very interesting, and the product becomes much more interesting as a result of that. So I wanted to show you how I did this, and you'll notice that there's certain forces that I applied to get this sort of bouncy or effusively happy idea. So I thought of this sort of like lifting and expanding thing. I thought of the sort of bouncy, stretchy curves. Those both feel very fun to me. I like the little like fun polka dots that we could show up in the details. But then I was thinking that at the heart of it all, it can't just be bubbly everywhere, that the bubbliness is actually going to get stronger if we contrast that against these sort of solid straights that remind us that this crate does have a job in the world. And when we put those ideas together, then it feels like this sort of bouncy, fun, playful thing. I even put a little smiley on there, on the label there, to reinforce that idea in a subtle way. And you'll notice that I didn't just apply this at the top level. We applied the same principle to each board that exists in this design. And then within the board, if we were to take this design even further, I would think about the texture and maybe the shapes of the nails as they're nailed into this thing, the types of colors that we're using, all to reinforce these same principles that bring the idea of effusive happiness. So that stochastic similarity is working down through it. I'm seeing in the comments a few people asking questions about if this will be available later. I think so. We'll see. So getting back into the rest of this, I want to take these ideas now and I want to show you how to apply this. So we're actually going to work a little bit in Photoshop. And I'm just going to double check and confirm that my Photoshop is showing my strokes as I paint. Did you all see that red stroke when I painted in there? Everybody seeing that? Chad has been going crazy the whole time, and now suddenly we're silent. I guess it's just because there's a delay, probably. Okay, everybody's seeing it. All right, it's just because we had a delay. Except Photoshop sometimes will cause this thing to disappear, and I'll try to make sure that it stays in there. All right, so here's what we're going to do. I've done an early sketch of what I imagine this thing would look like, and you can see we've got a couple layers here that I'm going to show up, and I wanted to show how I built the forest around it. Mostly the forest is just playing a supporting role. We're going to be focusing mostly on the shack as it sits up in the trees here. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to lay down the shapes first, and I'm going to build it all around this sort of columnar idea of this tree. I liked the idea of bringing into this tree some of those early concepts we were talking about, which let's actually go back to that. So if we go back to our presentation here, and we'll refer back to our design brief. So we're looking for something that has a rough wood shack. We're looking for something that sits in the trees of the haunted wood. We're definitely looking for something that feels like it's a home base where they're going to be retreating to it. Then they'll go off to attack the Duke's caravans, bring back their spoils, do whatever else they're going to do there. We want it to feel ancient. So that's really important. And then, of course, this wildness and the jury-rigged high-tech solutions are going to be important. Now, that's a lot to tackle all at once in a single design. But yeah, let's go in here. People are saying move the canvas to the right, and it's because I have my name right. I'm going to have my face sitting right over the top. So let's fix that right now. Okay, you should all be able to see this now together, and my face hopefully a little bit more out of the way. May occasionally still cover up the corners, but I'm going to start blocking in the shack over the top. And I usually work, by the way, you can use any design process that you want here. Personally, I like to work a little bit more with flat colors and kind of build everything on top. I'm going to be using a tool in Photoshop that allows me to erase the stroke using the same color. You'll see me do that occasionally, so if I hold down tilde, I can kind of scrape away using the same brush. And a lot of what I'm thinking about here is answering some of those questions of the design brief. So we want that sort of rough-hewn, everything is just kind of like thrown together, like they didn't really even know how to make a shack, but they did it, and they maybe used their witch's magic to make it hold together better. So we might even be able to break some of the rules of architecture here in the way that this thing all clings in here. And I really like the idea of giving it this sort of witch's hat feeling. You might have noticed it when I did the prop work before, that we had kind of that same idea showing, where you have this sort of like extruded, extended, maybe twisted sort of thing that tapers toward one end. This motif of the witch's hat. It's not really a particularly important thing to the story, but it is an important thing to the style. So we talked about, finding unity in the styles as being a great way to bring in a story element. This is exactly the type of thing I'm talking about. All right, so within this, let's give them a landing platform right here, and I'm going to extend it out a little bit. I like the idea of being able to look up at this thing, but this is a design after all, and we want to describe the area that the action is going to be happening. So I'm imagining they would fly in on their mechanized brooms and land here and retreat into the place. And we'll start with kind of a dark place that they'd be retreating into, but I may add lights later in this. And we'll just break up this edge just a little bit with some of those sticks. One of the reasons why I like to work this way with shapes is because I can tell if the shapes are communicating the idea without getting too much into the details. It's a good large scale way of looking at things. And so yeah, we'll work with this a little bit. But one of the things I also like about this is that I can start painting in detail anytime that I want. So for example, I might start separating out some of the sticks that make this thing up. And I think this motif of the twisting that's going on down here in the trunk, I really like that. And I feel like that's communicating a lot of the ideas that we're trying to get of it being ancient and being this sort of like witch's hideout. So I'm throwing in some of these kind of like twistier ideas on top. I think I'll let this whole area down here go a little darker overall so that we get the downward facing thing out of it. I would not worry too much about getting accurate lighting or anything. This is more about the design at this point than anything else. That said, I will separate things out if it makes it easier to read what's going on. I should probably bring the comments up over the side so that I can see if people are having a hard time. So the haunted wood component, we didn't really talk much about that yet, but I'm thinking that the haunted wood in this story is not actually a haunted wood. It's called that, but we would want something that feels a little bit scary so that people would think that it was haunted, but it wouldn't necessarily be really haunted. So we're not going to put ghosts in it, but the little slightly scary component to it might be a good one. All right, now we got a lot of this stuff working. And maybe going back to that witch's broom thing. So I like how this feels like the way that a broom, the bristles, like a witch's broom's bristles kind of come together. So that's really cool. And I think we could probably use that idea again to maybe bind up this stuff on top. We'll do the same thing down here. I just noticed that we have 800 people here. That's kind of crazy. I didn't expect we'd get that many. That's one cool thing about it being online. There's no way we'd get 800 people in one room at the in-person event. But I'm happy you're all here. This is pretty cool to be able to talk to everybody this way in the midst of the pandemic. All right, so I think this is feeling pretty good. Let's throw some supports in between here, like windows basically. And we'll keep this feeling a little bit rough hewn, but I'm thinking we might want to go a little more structural so it doesn't feel as much like a bird's nest and a little bit more like this is a place that people live. And so I may even bring in some slightly structural elements. So we talked about the contrasting ideas with that poisoned by power slide. And I'm going to be doing something similar here with just the that idea of what's the term that I used? Oh yeah, like the sort of like jury-rigged tech. I'm thinking like we'll have architectural elements that feel like regular people things, and then stuff that feels more like this crazy bird nest, and we're going to mash them together into the same design and then try to find unification to them. So first thing I'm going to start doing beyond that is I think I want to start introducing some lights in here, just so that it feels like there's actually some tech stuff happening. I'd say always go low key first. Don't go with like some kind of crazy generator thing with smoke stacks. We may add in something like that after the fact, but we want the first read of this to be more like this kind of crazy tower in the midst of everything. And so I'm going to bring, maybe we'll go with like a yellow so that it has this almost sickly witches sort of thing. Actually, no, this is supposed to be their retreat. Let's go with like an orange. They'll feel a little bit more friendly. Their home, and we want it to feel like a home. We want it to feel friendly, and I am imagining these would be the protagonists of the story, so we don't want them to be too creepy and weird. So toss some lights in there, and we may even put in some very specific hotter lights to make it feel like there's some activity going on inside rather than it being, this just generally lit, where we almost want it to feel like there's rooms inside. And I think I'll subdivide some of these so that they feel more like windows. Again, kind of interrupting the sort of witch's cottage feeling with something that has more of a practical kind of feeling to it. Might be good. And we might start putting in stuff like little wires that are hanging down. And then I think I'm going to put my first tech element here on the landing pad, like maybe it'll almost look like a helicopter landing pad. This brush is kind of hard to get like specific control out of, so we might have to work a little bit with this shape afterward. I was trying to go with a circle and it became kind of a rectangle. I want it to be a circle though. I feel like the circle does the helicopter landing pad a little bit better. Let's see if we can make it work here. And then I might even put in some kind of like painted logo on it or something. Like this witch's land here sort of thing. We'll do kind of the first generic idea first. Anything that communicates the idea symbolically super easily is always the best way to start. And then you can revise it for something later that's a little bit less generic. And at this point, I'm kind of feeling like my lines are getting in the way more than anything else. So I'm going to turn them down and start working with the design just as it sits here. Let's change some of the colors just at the tip of these things. I'm going to try and like pull out individual posts, of course, but I'm also thinking just to draw the attention down a little bit. So we want it to feel like it has that sort of witch's broom feeling, but we also want it to feel friendly, and I think we're getting that sort of ragged feeling, which I think is great for the witch thing, and we just have to like make it a little more friendly overall to get the communication of the protagonist thing. All right, so let's think about the individuality and the people that live here and what they bring to the table as part of this. Because I think we're getting the big, broad stroke, the sort of crazy witchiness happening. I think that's really nice. But I think I'm going to start adding some exterior tech that feels more like this is the people that live here. They're just kind of throwing things together in this hodgepodge way and doing really cool stuff with it. Making it much more high-tech and interesting. So we're going to take this tree color and I'm going to go with like a cooler metal. And I'm going to start off first with maybe like a stack of chimneys. I'm doing this on a separate layer so I can easily just kind of carve these elements away. I might even bring that witch's broom sort of thing here. And I might even bundle these together in a couple places just to increase the stability. but I think I'm going to make it so that the furnace that they're connected to actually goes out here. And I'm imagining almost something more like a blacksmith's forge. So something that just has like the heat of 1,000 suns burning inside it. And maybe we even have like a little bit of smoke kind of drifting up out of these. Although I don't know if I'll make it too much belching smoke. We'll make it so that it's kind of like this light smoke. We get the suggestion of smoke, but nothing too crazy. By the way, all the brushes that you see me using here, they are available for free on my site. If you just go to YouTube and type in Sam Nielsen CS6 brushes, then you can access all the brushes that I've got for Photoshop CS6. Or if you type in Sam Nielsen Photoshop brushes and you're using an earlier version than CS6, then you will be able to access many of the same brushes, but maybe not all of them. I've never really considered monetizing my brushes because even though I think they're cool brushes, there's like 5 of them and I use all of them for everything. So, all right, let's just get some of that fire in the belly sort of feeling with this furnace. I'm going to create a couple windows to it so it's almost like venting to the air outside, but maybe the smoke is still going out the top. And this doesn't feel super high-tech. That's the one problem I've got with it right now. It feels high-tech in the sense that it's higher tech than what we're seeing with everything else on the cottage, but it doesn't feel like something that's really, I don't know. I want something that feels a lot more higher tech than what we're getting right now. So I'm thinking maybe we get some tubes that roll down over the top and connect into other stuff, almost like power cables or other things like that. And then I'm also thinking to get that really high-tech thing, I might put in some shapes here that look a little bit less like your traditional sort of furnace thing and maybe a little bit more like, I'm imagining like Avengers level tech. Some kind of thing that's like spinning 1,000 miles per hour or something as it forges what's going on in there. And I think little lights, little like LED sorts of things really always help to kind of push that high-tech thing. So I know it doesn't really make sense right now to put it up on there, but we'll put it in there anyway. Let's control this now with something that sits down here that connects on the side of the stack. And then I'm also thinking maybe something that connects down here would be really good. I think I'm going to try and keep the silhouette of this thing unfettered with most of the tech. We're going to bring some of the tech down here on this side because I think this side of the image is really carrying the majority of the story of what I want to go or to happen. And even though this feels like it might be a little jury-rigged, I do like the idea of it being a consistent metal rather than it feeling like, you know, a bunch of different people fixed it. It's more like a crew of people kind of slapped it together very quickly. I'm not going to get into the tech design right now just because our presentation is going to be relatively short. Let's get a little bit of design work in this tree because I think the tree is as much a part of the hideout as anything else is. I'm going to turn these lines up because I might riff a little bit off some of the lines that I did here already. And I've done kind of this overcast gray background that I really like, and we'll try and keep that going with this tree as well. But I think we really want to push the age with this tree. Like this is just this ancient thing. So I'm thinking a little bit more breakup in the bark, but maybe we're also getting some really big kind of growths on it. I'm going to bring a couple of things that are growing out. I decided not to put leaves on this tree mostly just because I think it feels a little bit more like a witch's forest or a haunted forest sort of thing here. But maybe it's autumn or something like that. And up here we'll get a little bit more of that dry wood sort of vertical feeling. So we're getting more of that overall kind of rugged, like a wrinkly old face sort of feeling going on down here. And then up on the top of this design, we're getting a little bit more of that kind of ancient dry wood or driftwood sort of feeling. And I think those two should be able to work together as long as I bring some of the elements down here, which is one thing when you're doing this, especially when you're trying to mix a bunch of ideas together, is think about the idea of balance. So balance in design work or in painting work means to make sure that if you introduce an element somewhere, that you bring it in somewhere else. You never make a triangle that exists only in one element of your design. You're going to bring echoes of that triangle somewhere else so that it exists everywhere a little bit. So we'll use some shadowy sort of shapes down here. I'm going to work much more quickly for the rest of this because I want to move on to question and answers pretty soon here, because I imagine we'll probably have a lot of questions about how to apply this. Now, one thing you'll notice as I've been doing this is I've been working a lot with some of these motifs and bringing the motifs in there at this larger level. At some point, I'm going to need to get in close and start to bring some of those motifs in a little bit at the higher detail scale level. And I'm going to do that right here just so you can see. So for example, I think I'm going to make these vertical pillars be this steel that we've got. That sort of gunmetal color. Just to get a little bit more of that tech feeling to this whole place. And I don't know if I'll use it everywhere, but I like the sort of ramshackle put together sort of thing that we had going on that other. Metal, and so we'll bring some of that same idea in under here. One thing to watch out for when you're doing environment design is make sure that you're always thinking about how things connect together. You just never want a wall that just goes and shoots straight into the ground. You always want to have like a foot or a connection point, or show the technology by which it's being connected to the walls. We just tend to find that stuff really strange when it connects without any purpose. The exception is going to be if you're doing like ultra modern design work, in which case you're going to be finding ways to make it feel believable in other ways. But that's kind of my general across the board suggestion. I'm going to get some sort of vertical pillar things in here, and I'm going to reintroduce some of this like the poles or sticks sort of feeling that we've got in these pillars that are built in here. Even though they're metal, we're reintroducing that same idea again. And maybe we'll use this same metal across here on the windows. This brush doesn't paint well when it gets too small. I usually switch out for a different brush when I'm doing detail work. And then I think we could probably use like wood paneling down here, just so that it's not all high tech. Also, to sell the high tech thing, maybe I imagine that like they've got a force field going on here. So what I'll do is we'll paint a couple pillars, and then we'll introduce something that gives us the feeling of a force field connecting them together. A lot of what I'm doing here is based on shape language, and I know I didn't talk a lot about shape language, and shape language is a really good foundation. I kind of assumed that most people attending this would already understand something about design. If you're coming to a design that's talking about using character design principles, I'm not going to teach you about character design, but if there are questions about why I'm doing some of the things I'm doing, we'll take those questions in a minute, and I'll be happy to add information if I didn't include it in the talk. So let's introduce something that feels like this sort of high-tech shield. So I'm going to use a blue here because that feels like a good high-tech shield color, and we're going to introduce it maybe right along the interior of these pillars. I know that's not super practical, but These are witches, they're not engineers. They're just doing what they can to keep people out of their place here. So I'm putting this on a separate layer so I can put these lights in and then erase it as I want. So I'm going to do a repeating pattern here so that we get the feeling of digital lights. I know I'm not being super careful about distancing here, but this is kind of a crazy haphazard world anyway, so it's okay if all of our lines aren't straight in this style. All right, so now I might even do just a split in that as well. And now to reinforce the idea that that's a shield, I might just get another brush that'll allow me to throw a quick speckly sort of texture down. Let's do, I use a lot of Kyle Webster's brushes, and I think they'll probably work just fine for this sort of thing. So I'm going to do a little speckle that generates mostly from those corners, so I'll erase this where it's actually covering up the metal where the shield isn't happening. And we'll erase it in the center, and I think I'll make it a screen layer just so it feels like it's an additive sort of magical effect, and we'll also make it so it stops at the ground where it's being generated. And normally I'd go in and make these other pillars metal and stuff, but for the sake of time and so that we can get on to question and answers, I'm going to move quickly through this last little bit. So we get this sort of like sparkly shield. And I'd probably work a bit more to get the edges working. Guess it won't hurt to just throw something in there. Let's use this occlusion brush to kind of push those edges, and I'll make this again maybe a screen layer with this blue, and we'll just add a glow around that outer edge. Just really send that idea home that we're getting a shield. That glow just kind of helps do the last little bit. So anyway, I think I would spend a bit more time working with the technology and trying to figure out what each part is doing. I know I kind of threw that together, but this is a pretty good start on this. The other thing I feel like we're missing, or that we're getting here, is maybe too many small shapes. And so I'd probably look for some big, medium, and small in the breakup of those. But that gives a pretty good idea as to where I would go and how I would apply a lot of the principles that we talked about in this session. So I'll open it up now to questions. So I'll watch the chat for questions and see what you guys got. I see a question that says, do you have any tips to create environment design and to not overwork it, or how to not get lost in drawing forest, for example? So yeah, this is a really complicated scene, and I wanted to make it be just about the one thing, but if I had to fill this scene out and do more stuff, I would actually think first and foremost about composition. I'm doing a lecture tomorrow on composition, so if you want to learn how to manage composition, it will actually make it much easier to take a scene like this and make it work together. So that's what I'd recommend, is think composition first. Always think composition. I'm thinking graphic composition, and then after that you start thinking about placement and perspective and all the other things so you don't get lost in it. Everybody says, what is a good canvas size? So the canvas size I always work at is at least 2,000 pixels on the smallest dimension. So a lot of the time I'll go 3,000 to 4,000 pixels on the smallest dimension, just so that we're getting plenty of stuff. You never know when you're going to have to print your thing out as a poster or in an art book, or you're going to want to sell prints of it or whatever later. So always work a little bit bigger. Somebody says, do you find this idea of fractals also in classic traditional artwork? Yes, in the sense that when you're dealing with either human architecture, nature, there is fractal composition in everything that you will see. but people that are really thoughtful about it will be actually pushing that further and kind of bringing those ideas into the design a little bit more. But that said, it's like when you're designing something, especially for something that's animated, that is able to be in this imaginative realm, where everything is possible, you kind of have to limit it down to a few things that really communicate your message, and that's where this really becomes helpful. A question about how do you select a color palette that fits with the design motif or story elements, and do you often start with more neutral colors at first? So I always start with a color scheme and then break it from there. So just think of the traditional color schemes: analogous, complementary, split complementary, triadic, tetradic, monochromatic. You're always starting from that and then kind of working outward from there. It keeps me from getting out of control with my colors when I think that way. This scene right here is more of a tetradic color scheme, where it ended up now with the browns and yellows opposing against the cyans and the sort of greenish colors. So let's see. How do fractals apply to cars again? Okay, so let's show you something from the lecture. So this is the Ferrari LaFerrari, and when you get a really great team of designers on a car, you're not going to be able to find this in like a Nissan Sentra or something like that. You're going to find this in really well designed cars, but notice how this car right here has this sort of leaf design. It's kind of a blade or a leaf or a feather, and it's kind of skewed towards one side, and you'll notice that design motif is being used over and over and over again. And if I think if you could find a way to turn around this car, you'll notice that they keep reusing it over and over again at different scales, and they're cropping it off and changing the scale of it. So that's a great way of kind of keeping a design unified that way. I'd say think about kind of the shape language and the symbolism of that shape and what you're trying to do, what kind of forces are being applied to that shape. Because then when you run into a situation where that shape doesn't work exactly, like here on the hub, whatever it is, the rims, then you think about the same forces that are being applied to that, and you apply it to the new shape, and it should still work, even though you're not getting the exact same thing. Are there any resources that discuss the design principles you've mentioned in more detail? A really good kind of first introduction to a lot of the design principles that I'm talking about is Universal Principles of Design by William Lidwell and a bunch of other people. He's the one that I remember the most because he's at the top of the list. I guess that's why you end up being at the top of the list if you get a book published. Let's see. How do you keep consistency among your stylized designs for the same world? Often I adopt true props, for instance, and one looks more realistic than the other. Okay, that's a really great question. And what you have to understand is that there's actually a range of possibility that could be okay within the same world. So for example, you might have most of the protagonist's world and the place that they came from be a little bit more cartoony and fun and bubbly, and then they go into the dark lands and wherever the villain is, and the villain stuff has a little bit more of this edgy kind of realistic feeling to it. And so as long as you understand that your world can shift a little bit from one place to another in order to tell the story that you're trying to tell, then that becomes a tool that you now manipulate to tell the story. What you don't want to do is have it so that in the protagonist's bubbly world, now there's just a totally normal chair. You want to make sure that everything is being reacted to by kind of the same forces, that it's telling stories in a very similar way, and then you won't run into that problem. But if then the characters get into another part of the world and it's appropriate for the story, totally fine for it to change some of the design language. Okay, so link to the brushes will be appreciated. So the link to the brushes is go to Google and type in Sam Nielsen CS6 brushes. There's your link. Okay. Will this be on YouTube? Yeah, I'm going to plan to publish it later. And let's see. Are there any books or media that you would recommend to improve shape language? So Steven Silver has a great book on character design that I would recommend that will teach you about shape language. I would strongly recommend it. And so let's see. How much would you say is too much when combining different elements, making any type of design, witch or tech and whatever? So Ian McCaig taught something that I really liked and I've used a lot in my design work since I watched a workshop of his years ago, which is it's a costume design principle where you just design like crazy. You put all the stuff that you want to into it, and then you strip everything out except for one thing. Strip out all the costume elements until you just have one or two things that tell your story. And so I think it's better not to start into a design worrying about bringing too many elements in. It's better to actually just kind of go crazy with the stuff that you think is going to tell the story, and then kind of save the stripping things out for your second pass. That said, I think if you're really thoughtful about the type of shape language, the type of message you're trying to bring across, you can come up with a thematic statement or whatever. Sometimes you can save yourself from having to do too much and having to do that second step. The danger that comes with that is that sometimes if you start with a message and you're thinking too much about the message, you can get tunnel vision, and then you lose all the possibilities of coolness that might come when you start crashing elements together. So I would actually separate those design passes personally is the best way to avoid that. So simplification is an important one, but better to do not all at once. Okay, let's see. An element or principle that you think is undervalued or underestimated by most artists. Man, that's a tough one. Honestly, I think theme and using theme in design is something that I think most people don't realize how incredibly powerful as a tool it is. We talked a little bit, I introduced what theme is and how it works with this poisoned by power and how we combined those ideas. A good way to think about theme is you have element A and element B, and then you figure out what element A does to element B or what element B does to element A, and then you basically have a sentence. That sentence is a theme. I usually like to start with visual elements because sometimes people will start out with this flowery sentence that describes what they want to say, but they can't figure out what that means in terms of visual language. So much better to focus on the visual language first and what you want that visual language to say, and then figure out how the theme kind of emerges from that visual language. So somebody says, I'm an aspiring illustrator. Is color and light better to start studying digitally or traditionally? I think probably it's easier to study color and light digitally, I would think. It's much easier to study color traditionally. So if you're trying to learn color theory, you probably ought to learn traditionally. If you're trying to study light, then you're probably going to want to lean digital. So how do you keep your character design consistent to the universe therein while also being unique? That's a good question. And even though this isn't a character design presentation, I think the same thing that I said earlier about being able to have different design language between elements or different parts of the world, you could also have it so that the characters of your world follow a slightly different design language than the world itself. As long as they feel like they live together, it should be fine. Now, the question was about how do you make it so they live together? What I would do is look at some of these forces that you have that shape the world that you're designing and see what those forces would do to a character design. Again, kind of take your character design through a filter, as it were, of those design principles. So let's see. What are the main differences between working in video game concept art and working in animation concept art? I assume that you're talking like TV or film when you say animation concept art. So for me, my biggest experience working in film versus game is that film is all about what you're seeing on the camera. And it tends to be with film, because everything goes very, very quickly in film, you need everything to read just super fast. And because of that quick read that needs to happen, everything has to be really, really stripped down. Whereas in video games, the player's in control, especially when you've got any type of camera control. The player can spend forever in a single room just looking around at stuff. And generally speaking, video games tend to want stuff that is more detailed and where there's stories in every little thing everywhere. As they look around, there's more and more stuff to look at. So one of the things that's the biggest difference that I found between video game design and doing film design is that film design, it tends to be all about the larger story and how the characters fit into that story. Whereas in video games, a lot of the time the video design language, the game design language is going to be about what you can do. So it becomes all about the choices that the player can make and what the ramifications of those choices are. And so that's what your story kind of starts to center around when you're doing character design or environment design. You're thinking all the time about, what does this mean for what I can do? How does this change the way that the player interacts with the world? Okay. Let's see. There's a bunch of comments, but I'm looking for questions. So there's a question that says, those principles still work for animation. Where do you need to simplify the shapes? So when you're talking about animation in film or in television, I'd say simplifying the shapes or whatever. And I don't know, I'm trying to think of two different answers to this question that could both be true. And I think multiple artists might have different answers. For me personally, I found that when you're working in film or TV, it's all about that first read. So I like to zoom way out or to back out or squint my eyes so that I'm looking at it different so that I can see how all the shapes work together. And if it's not giving me the story in an instant, if I don't get what that story is just at a first glance, and if I can't see it in thumbnail form, then it's not good enough. So let's see. Is imitating an artist's style for a book considered plagiarism? Ooh, that's a good question. I would say anytime that you're imitating styles, you're getting into a little bit of dicey territory, because a lot of the time an artist has put a lot of work into developing what they're trying to do for that style. I would talk to the artist and find out if they're okay with it for sure, if you're going to imitate their style. That said, I highly recommend learning to imitate people's styles. You will learn so much from emulation. But the purpose of emulation is so that you can learn how to control style, and so that you can basically move and become fluid between style languages as you need to, rather than copying. I think that would be the main goal of it. Okay, somebody asked about painting in grayscale, and the design work that I did today was all in color, but you could totally do it in grayscale. In fact, I might do that just for the sake of speed. So if it's faster to go grayscale first, do it. I just tend to work very quickly in paint, so adding color. So anyway, I think that is it. So thank you everybody for attending, and we'll see you later, maybe at one of my other presentations. Thanks.